Hello, welcome finally to Lecture 9 in Modern Political Theory. Again, I am very sorry that I've had to delay posting this, but my first efforts at recording a lecture on Rousseau were just so bloody awful. I couldn't live with myself and post them. So hopefully this will be better. So today we cross the channel, having spent the first part of the semester in the presence of John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, two English political theorists. We head to continental Europe and focus on Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his theory of the social contract in Du Contrat Social. Rousseau, as you know, spent most of his life in France and was a French speaker, but he was actually born in Geneva, which is a city in present-day Switzerland. And Geneva, as you perhaps know, was in the 18th century an independent political state. It was a city republic, a little bit like some of the city-states of Italy, like Venice and Florence, and of course all the way back to the ancient Republic of Rome, which was originally a city-state, and also, of course, the Greek city-states of Sparta and Athens and Milos and so forth. Although he would later renounce his Genevan citizenship, I think it's important to keep in mind that he retained a deep admiration for the republican institutions of his native city of Geneva throughout his life. And this informs a lot of his political thought, particularly in Du Contrat Social, in his social contract. And I'll be drawing attention to some of the commonalities there later in these lectures. Although he was born in Geneva, he left that city quite early in his life, I think at age 16, and spent most of the rest of his life, as I've said, in France as an itinerant literary figure. He never really settled down. He was never in one place or one job for very long. And he was always, to some extent, an outsider in any particular social milieu in which he found himself. And that accounts, I think, for his tendency towards paranoia and a sense of not fitting in, which I think is in some ways important to keep in mind as you think about him. He did a variety of jobs. He was a tutor, he was a secretary, he was a laborer, but as I say, he was never any of these things for very long. But he did display a talent for worming his way into influential intellectual circles, and successfully cultivated friendships with some of the major intellectual figures of the French Enlightenment during the 18th century. So he eventually became a very widely known figure, a kind of public intellectual whose works were enthusiastically read in France and beyond. He really bursts on the scene in 1750. He puts in for a major literary prize sponsored by the Academy of Dijon in France, hence the color of our slides for this lecture, mustard colored, because Dijon is, of course, the home of one very famous mustard. The Academy of Dijon advertises this prize, and Rousseau puts in for it and writes what comes to be known as his first discourse on the origin of the sciences and arts. And he wins, and that pretty much guarantees that he sort of hits the big time at that point. And that, in addition to his several other successful novels and also some plays, sort of cements his reputation as a major public intellectual of the time. He was also a musician. He composed several works of music and a couple of operas. But again, all of this occurs against the background of a sense of not really fitting in anywhere. And his life was somewhat unhappy. He was constantly falling out with people and developed something of a persecution complex. This became particularly clear when, at a certain point, when he was being felt ostracized by the philosophe in Paris, the Scottish philosopher David Hume invited him over to Britain, and he came over and was in Britain for a while, but also began to suspect that Hume himself was plotting against him and accused Hume of all kinds of horrible things, and so they eventually fall out. So it's perhaps not surprising then that Jacob Talman, who wrote this famous book The Origins of Totalitarian Democracy, described Rousseau in the following terms. He said Rousseau was one of the most ill-adjusted and egocentric natures who have ever left a record of their predicament. Like Hobbes and Locke, Rousseau's political theory invests in the idea of a social contract, and that, of course, is the view that is developed in Du Contrat Social on the social contract. But his relationship to social contract theory is somewhat complicated and ambiguous. Later on in the semester, we're going to read Rousseau's second discourse, his discourse on the origin of inequality. And as some of you already may know, in the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, Rousseau discusses a state of nature, or gives a state of nature theory, and he engages in that context with the accounts of the state of nature that you find in Hobbes and Locke. And that tempts a lot of people to link the discourse with Du Contrat Social, and to assimilate Rousseau's theory of the social contract to the kind of theory that you find in Hobbes and Locke. So on that sort of reading, the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality gives Rousseau's account of the state of nature, and then on the social contract gives Rousseau's account of how you overcome the problems of the state of nature. And on that interpretation, you assimilate this pair of linked texts to the kind of theory that you find in Hobbes and Locke. And I think it's important to see that that's not a helpful way to read Rousseau. There are a couple of reasons for this. The Discourse on the Origin of Inequality is, I think, the start of something new, something that turns quite sharply away from the social contract tradition. That text, as you'll discover, is mainly an attack on the social contract theory and on Hobbes and Locke in particular. And as I'll be arguing later on in the semester, I think the second discourse is much more a forward-looking document. It's something that prepares the path for the kind of theory that you're going to find in Marx, and the kind of theory that you find in Marx is very different from anything that we've encountered so far. I think it's also important to notice that although on the social contract certainly makes occasional references to the state of nature and its problems, that aspect of the argument is very much in the background. The idea of a state of nature actually occurs quite rarely in the text of Du Contrat Social and doesn't really play much of a role in its argument. Moreover, in the discourse, the state of nature is not represented in the way it is in Hobbes and Locke. In Hobbes and Locke, the state of nature is represented as dysfunctional, as a source of problems. It's a place in which life is brutish and problematic in Hobbes. It's haunted by inconveniences in Locke's story. And both Hobbes and Locke think of the state as the solution to the problems of the state of nature. But in Rousseau's Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, the state of nature is depicted very, very differently. It's not at all dysfunctional. Indeed, Rousseau inverts the relationship between civilized society and his state of nature in the second discourse. He actually wants to argue that in many ways the state of nature is a better situation for human beings to be in than the civilized state. So that makes it, I think, quite difficult to assimilate the relationship between these two texts to the kind of argument about the state of nature and the social contract that you find in Hobbes and Locke. And so for that reason, I find it helpful to treat these two works of Rousseau, the Discourse and On the Social Contract, independently. So we're going to focus in these two lectures for this week just on the social contract, just on Du Contrat Social. We'll leave the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality till later. So in some ways a slightly strange way to proceed, but I think substantively it makes more sense, and I hope you'll agree with me by the time we end the class. There's also a more philosophical reason why I think it makes sense to treat Du Contrat Social as a freestanding text and consider it on its own, apart from any relationship to the second discourse and Rousseau's other writings. Because Rousseau makes an important methodological shift away from the paradigm that you find in Hobbes and Locke. it's easy to miss this. It's easy not to notice, but I think it's quite important. The theories that you get in Hobbes and Locke, as you know, are theories of the social contract that depend on the idea that in a natural state, individuals already have certain kinds of natural rights. And it's those natural rights that get exchanged in the social contract when the state is instituted, at least under Locke's and Hobbes's approach. But like a number of thinkers in the 18th century, notably his contemporary David Hume, whom I already mentioned, Rousseau is skeptical of this idea of natural rights. He doesn't think it's a useful way to think about the nature of people's rights, to think of them as natural in some way. This comes as a bit of a surprise because, of course, Rousseau was very influential on the French Revolution. And as you know, the French Revolution was all about the rights of man and the natural rights of humanity and so forth. So it's easy to come to Rousseau with the expectation that he's just a traditional natural rights theorist. But I think he isn't. He's much closer to those skeptics about natural rights, like David Hume, his contemporary. And you can think of the basic point that Hume and Rousseau want to make about natural rights in the following way. Think of them as both radicalizing the kind of anti-naturalism that you find in Hobbes. Remember, Hobbes begins his political theory by saying the state doesn't exist by nature. It's an artifice, it's a contrivance, it's something that human beings have to socially construct, otherwise it doesn't exist. But what Rousseau and Hume want to say about natural rights is that if you are really going to insist on this anti-naturalism, you're really going to take seriously the idea that the fundamental terms of political life are artificially constructed, you have to be consistent in that, and you have to apply the same analysis to rights themselves, because in the end of the day, rights can't exist by nature any more than the state can. You're going to see a very similar argument to that in the classical utilitarians. Bentham, of course, famously says the idea of natural rights is nonsense. It's nonsense on stilts. And he's getting this from Hume. And his point is that the idea of a right makes no sense outside of the context of some set of social and legal institutions. If you don't have social and legal institutions that confer rights on people, then you don't have any rights at all. Rights are no more part of nature than is the state. The idea that a right is a natural object in the way that a tree or a fish is a natural object doesn't really make sense. And Rousseau basically accepts that, although it's not so clear in the early part of the social contract, but I think that is his view. It comes out, for example, quite clearly in this statement in chapter 1, book 1. Rousseau says, "The social order is a sacred right that serves as a foundation for all other rights. Nevertheless, this right does not come from nature. It is therefore founded on agreement," right? So what Rousseau is saying there is that the agreement that forms the social contract is not an exchange of natural rights. It's a different kind of agreement in which human beings come together, form a political community, and commit themselves to various things, but they're not exchanging something they already possess, called their natural rights. This anti-natural rights view is also playing a role substantively in some of the early moves in Du Contrat Social, which discuss literature that we haven't really read, some other social contract theorists like the Dutch theorist Hugo Grotius, and that discussion may have lost you a little bit. It's not terribly important, but there is an underlying point that I want to at least emphasize that is connected to this Humean critique of natural rights, because what Rousseau is arguing in these early moves is that natural rights arguments have a fatal tendency to confuse facts about power and power relationships between people with claims about what people have rights to do and not do. And very much like Hume, Rousseau is uncomfortable with the idea that facts about the world and value judgments about the world are not to be confused with each other. And he thinks that one of the effects of in investing heavily in natural rights arguments is that we wind up confusing the de facto balance of power and what is naturally right and naturally wrong, right? So he goes to some pains to argue in the early part of On the Social Contract that in these natural rights theorists, there is this continual tendency to allow the de facto balance of power to determine what is in fact naturally right. And he uses this to quite strong effect, I think, to push back against the claim you find in Hobbes and Locke that slavery can be upheld as a legitimate institution in a situation of domination and conquest. I just wanted to highlight that this is an important part of the motivation of Rousseau's argument in On the Social Contract. He's trying to get away from that conception, and one of his great virtues is that he's much more clear-headed, I think, about the inappropriateness of any form of slavery between individuals. So there is in all of this quite clearly at least an implicit critique of Hobbes, although I'll go on to later suggest that Rousseau nonetheless remains very much within the Hobbesian paradigm, much more Hobbesian than he is Lockean, but we'll get to that in a moment. Let me mention, first of all, just an ancillary, a kind of supplementary objection to Hobbes that Rousseau makes, just because it's an interesting objection. It's in the social contract very, very subtly, but if you want to really appreciate the objection, you can see it in another of Rousseau's texts called The State of War, which is actually in your little Hackett anthology if you're interested. It's a relatively short piece. I didn't assign it, but if you're interested in this argument, you might look at it. But there are a couple of passages in Du Contrat Social in which Rousseau makes the same basic point. And the objection is, look, Hobbes says the state solves the problem of the state of nature, right? The state of nature is perpetual war, but the state will put an end to perpetual war. But Rousseau says, look, Hobbes' solution is unstable. It doesn't really solve that problem. All it does is to kick it upstairs and in some ways make it worse, because we exit the state of nature and join with our state, but our state then becomes an enormously powerful institution that amasses lethal weaponry and so forth, and then finds itself in another state of nature with all the other states in the world that then confront each other with lethal force, and will continually lapse into major international conflict, which of course they continually did during the 17th and 18th centuries. And Rousseau wants to say, look, that's not really a stable solution to the problem. All it does is to turn the conflict of the state of nature into international conflict and international wars, and those wars can be just as, if not more, destructive and dangerous than the kinds of conflicts that you get in the state of nature. So there's that objection to Hobbes, which I think is an interesting one for you to consider. But it's not really, I think, central to his argument in Du Contrat Social. The more central critique of Hobbes in Du Contrat Social is one about individual freedom and independence. And it amounts, I think, to the charge that Hobbes just doesn't take individual freedom seriously enough. And to some extent, this objection is related to something I mentioned when I was doing Hobbes, this distinction drawn by Isaiah Berlin between a negative concept of freedom, which interprets freedom just in terms of the absence of external obstacles to a person's actions, and a more, as Berlin puts it, positive conception of freedom that interprets liberty and freedom in terms of the presence of a certain kind of self-mastery, a certain kind of self-direction. And it's quite clear throughout Rousseau's oeuvre that he embraces a conception of freedom that is much, much closer to that positive ideal of freedom as self-determination and autonomy. Over and over again, Rousseau says that free societies and free individuals are independent, autonomous, and self-determining. They form their own will, and they're able then to follow and pursue their own will, right? I think the attack on Hobbes and Locke for their willingness to uphold slavery is implicitly understood by Rousseau as a symptom of their failure to appreciate the special importance of personal self-direction and autonomy for the idea of political freedom. And you have in Du Contrat Social early on this very, very famous remark: to be driven by appetite alone is slavery, while obedience to a law which we prescribe to ourselves is liberty, right? And that's clearly pointing towards this positive notion of freedom, because it's the idea of self-prescription. We lay down the law for ourselves. Nobody else gets to lay down the law for ourselves. And we're only free if we can say of ourselves that the laws that we follow, the rules that we follow, are the ones that we ourselves endorse. And of course, this general statement about being driven by appetite alone, while obedience to law which we prescribe to ourselves as liberty, this foreshadows in lots of ways, as some of you may know, the moral theories of Immanuel Kant, who was a great admirer of Rousseau. As you know, Kant has this view of the moral will as being a kind of will in which human beings act on their own autonomy and act morally for its own sake. And are not, they refuse to be motivated by their appetites or their preferences or their desires, and the will only has moral status for Kant to the extent that it's purged of those kinds of appetitive or preference-based motives. And this statement clearly foreshadows Kant in various ways. And like Kant too, Rousseau connects this idea of freedom as autonomy with an ideal of the dignity of the human person, right? So there's already a kind of foreshadowing of a certain kind of Kantian view here. Not surprisingly, therefore, Rousseau's objections to Hobbes echo what I called in my lectures on Hobbes the civic republican critique of Hobbes, right? The civic republicans had assumed that the opposite of freedom is not interference or external impediments or obstacles to possible action. The opposite of freedom is slavery, right? And a truly free society from a civic republican point of view is one that is not enslaved. What does a free society have to be like in order to not be enslaved? It has to be a society of which one can say that it forms and then is in a position to follow its own will, its own choices for itself. But a bit like some of Hobbes' civic republican critics in the 17th century, Rousseau worries, and I'm going to elaborate on this, Rousseau worries that Hobbes' social contract allows a third party, namely his sovereign, to dictate a society's own will for it. And this is a form, Rousseau thinks, of collective enslavement. And part of what he wants to do in Du Contrat Social is to emancipate the social contract from that kind of collective slavery. But the formula I've given there on the slide is a bit condensed. And what I'm going to be doing in the next few minutes is to try to elaborate this idea and make it slightly less mysterious. I think it's important to keep in mind here, and again, I'll say more about this later, although Rousseau is certainly stimulated by a desire to criticize Hobbes, by a sense that Hobbes is getting something fundamentally wrong, Rousseau is nonetheless still operating within a fundamentally Hobbesian framework, and because he accepts a number of key Hobbesian assumptions. For example, he accepts and fully endorses Hobbes' view that agents will a state, they voluntarily set it up, fundamentally in order to protect their lives and possessions, because they realize that their lives and possessions will be insecure in the absence of a state, right? And that's why they try to get out of the state of nature by voluntarily contracting into a state under the kind of formula that Hobbes recommends. So Rousseau also therefore presupposes with Hobbes that, as it were, the will of the state, right, which is nothing other than the will of the individuals who set it up, that the will of the state includes at its heart a commitment, as Rousseau puts it on the social contract, to defend and protect with all common forces the person and goods of each associate. Again, there's nothing in that statement with which Hobbes would disagree. It's still straightforwardly Hobbesian orthodoxy. And of course, he also agrees with Hobbes and also Locke that states have to be established by willing agreement, by a kind of compact. They're not things that arise naturally. Individuals have to choose to establish them, and they have to agree to establish them in some conscious way. But Rousseau wants to add to all of this Hobbesian apparatus a strong additional proviso. Rousseau wants to say, look, to be legitimate, right, the social agreement, the social contract that institutes a state must be such that each party to the contract, quote, while uniting with all, nevertheless obeys only himself or herself and remains as free as before, right? And that, of course, looks back to this idea of freedom as self-direction, right? And what he's trying to insist on here is that a valid social contract must, in order to be legitimate, give full weight to the importance of preserving the autonomy and self-direction of each party to the social contract. And for reasons I'll get into in a moment, Rousseau thinks that Hobbes's contract doesn't meet that condition. To meet that proviso, that while uniting with all, each nevertheless obeys only himself and remains as free as before, Rousseau says that the social compact that is unanimously agreed to must be an agreement to follow the following formula. That is, sovereignty is always held by the people. And by the people, Rousseau here means the full assembly of all citizens, with each citizen having an equal voice in the decision-making process of the sovereign. That body, which is fully inclusive of the full citizenry of the state, with each citizen having an equal voice, that body must always retain sovereignty, final control over the laws of its political association, its political community. And that's why he thinks Hobbes goes wrong, because Rousseau thinks, and again I'm going to elaborate on this, in allowing sovereignty to be represented by a person other than the whole assembly of citizens, a monarch or some aristocratic council or a group of oligarchs, right? Hobbes can't satisfy that proviso. That's why ultimately, for Rousseau, Hobbes's doctrine winds up being a kind of slavery contract in which individuals essentially surrender their self-determination and independence as a free political community to the sovereign. And so the kind of politics that you wind up with on Hobbes's analysis, at least as Rousseau sees it, is a form of despotism, a form of slavery in which the people is subordinated completely to the sovereign. And that's what Rousseau wants to move away from, obviously. Just to flesh this critique out, because it's an important point and it's also a somewhat complicated point, let's just go back for a moment to Hobbes and try to pinpoint exactly the point on which Rousseau is departing from Hobbes. One way to think about Hobbes's political theory is to see him as asking the question, well, how is it possible for there to even be a people? After all, each of us lives from our own point of view. We live from the inside. We're motivated fundamentally by our own appetites and aversions. It's very difficult for us to know what appetites and aversions are motivating others. We therefore have different interests, different goals, and we reserve rights to make our own judgments about how best to preserve ourselves. And of course, that brings us into systematic conflict of various kinds. Conflicts over beliefs, conflicts over scarce resources and so forth. And Hobbes wants to say that the fundamental thing you've got to understand about human relationships is that fundamentally we don't naturally cohere together in groups. Rather, we confront each other as independent individuals who are struggling with each other over scarce resources and to preserve our lives, right? And given this sort of radical individualism, Hobbes asked, well, how is it possible for people who are like that to form a people or a community at all? How can they even be a people if everything is so radically relativized to the individual's point of view? And as you know, his answer is a characteristically radical one. He wants to say, in order for there to be a people, it has to first be represented, or as he puts it, personated by a sovereign. Some concrete person or body of people has to speak for or will on behalf of a political community in order for there to be a people at all. Unless you have a representative who speaks for and wills on behalf of a group, there is no people at all. Right? I mean, this is a complicated thought to have. Some have suggested that a way to make it slightly less mysterious is to think about the phenomenon of a class action lawsuit, right? So imagine that some company has produced, some gizmo, set of nail clippers, or something you put near the engine of your car. Who knows what it is? Doesn't really matter. But it injures people who use it, right? The nail clippers cause you to get gangrene and your fingers fall off or something like that. And so a large number of people who bought these products and used them suffer some kind of injury. And a law firm steps forward and represents this class of people who've all suffered this injury in court and sues the company for damages on behalf of the class of people who've suffered injury as a result of using the product, right? In this situation, this class of people is just a kind of dispersed group of people. They may live in different towns. They may be complete strangers to each other. They have no communication. They may have very little in common with each other, except for the fact that they've all unfortunately bought these defective nail clippers and they've all got gangrene and their fingers have fallen off. That's the only thing that they have in common. But as such, they're not capable of forming a kind of collectivity that can act together on its own behalf. That becomes possible, though, at the moment where a lawyer or an attorney represents them in a courtroom as their spokesperson and pleads the case on their behalf. And that's very much the way Hobbes thinks about the formation of a people. He thinks that a people can't exist until there is some agent, like the lawyer in the class action example, that speaks for them. Until you've got an agent or a representative like that, there is no group here that can act or have a will or choose or be represented in a courtroom or anything like that. Right? So you have to have a representative for Hobbes in order for there to be a people. So notice that Hobbes therefore has to reject this Lockean idea that you can have a people in advance of the establishment of a sovereign state. Right? In Locke's view, the people kind of constitute themselves first at the first stage of his contract, and then they make a bargain with the state to agree to be ruled on certain kinds of terms. For Hobbes, that whole idea makes no sense. It puts the cart before the horse, because a people doesn't exist as such. It's mute. It can't speak for itself until it has some representative to speak for it. And that representative is, of course, the Hobbesian sovereign. And in the Hobbesian story, it's that sovereign that then creates a people. It's not the other way around, as in Locke's story. In Locke's story, a people is possible even before a state, and that people can then establish a state. But from a Hobbesian point of view, that makes absolutely no sense, because you can't have a people at all until you've got a spokesperson to speak for it or on its behalf. And that's what the sovereign does. Until you have a sovereign, you just don't have a people. And of course, it's another feature of Hobbes's view that the sovereign constitutes a people because it acts on and represents a will that we all know the people share. That is their will, their common will to preserve themselves and to survive. So that's Hobbes's view, as you hopefully can see. Where does Rousseau agree and disagree with Hobbes? I think it's important to see that Rousseau accepts the second and third of those claims, but he rejects the first, right? So he accepts the idea that you can't have a people until you've established a state or a sovereign. He thinks Hobbes is right to think that you can't have a people until you've got some entity that speaks for it, till you have a sovereign. So the second claim is right. He also agrees with Hobbes that the sovereign constitutes a people insofar as it represents or acts on their will to preserve themselves. I shouldn't have used the word represent there. But what he rejects is the idea that the will that the people come to share in forming a sovereign is one that can be represented by anything other than the people itself. So the people, in Rousseau's conception, because he rejects Hobbes's idea of a representative sovereign, the people is a self-determining collectivity that has its own general will, and that general will cannot be represented, Rousseau insists, by anything other than itself. And of course, Rousseau's conclusion here is that sovereignty has to be, in a fundamental sense, popular sovereignty. It has to be exercised democratically by the full assembly of people willing for itself, expressing its general will. And it must never alienate the right to express its own will for itself to some third-party representative like a monarch or an oligarchical council. Whereas, of course, in Hobbes's theory, because he accepts one, sovereignty is always representative in something like the way a lawyer represents a class of people. But Rousseau wants to say, no, the model for sovereignty is not the model of a class action lawsuit, of a group of people that is mute until you've got some representative that speaks for it. The model for sovereignty is a model of a political community that always speaks for itself and only for itself, and won't allow anybody else, any alien body or group to speak for it, right? So that's the point at which Rousseau and Hobbes part company. Now, as I've already mentioned, at the heart of Rousseau's view, then, is this idea of a general will, right? A will that belongs to this democratically organized sovereign that includes equally every citizen in a given political community. Now, the notion of the general will, the volonté générale, as Rousseau calls it, this category is notoriously obscure, and people have struggled ever since the writing of Du Contrat Social to decode and decrypt Rousseau's meaning. So if you're struggling to understand what exactly Rousseau means by this category, it's not your fault entirely. It's not really fully clear. So let me try to clarify it. A first point to note is that this whole rubric, this whole language of particular wills and general wills that you find in Rousseau, it's not original with Rousseau. It's in the air in French political and actually especially theological discourse throughout the 18th century and all the way back into the 17th century. Figures like Montesquieu and Malebranche and Diderot, they'd all used this. And I'd like to quote a passage from the 17th century mathematician and philosopher Blaise Pascal, who in his Pensées writes the following. He says, imagine a body, and he has in mind here the physical body of an individual person, made up of thinking members, right? So he's imagining that we have bodies, but the parts of our bodies, our feet, our hands, our ears, our hair, our nostrils, etc., that each of these individual parts of the body have the capacity, as it were, to think for themselves, right? And he says, well, look, in that case, if the feet and the hands had a volonté particulière, they had their own wishes for themselves, right? The body as a whole would never be in order unless they submitted their volonté particulière to the volonté première which governs the whole body. And the volonté première here is something close to what Rousseau means by the general will. Outside of that general will, these individual parts of the body will be in disorder and unhappiness. But in willing the good of the body, they will their own good. Pascal goes on to say, one must incline to what is general, and leaning toward oneself is the beginning of all disorder in war, in policy, in economy, in the particular body of man. Thus the will is depraved. What I want you to take away from Pascal's observation, which is already in various ways foreshadowing the way Rousseau talks about these matters, is that the language of particular wills and general will refers to cases involving complex wholes comprising individual parts that potentially can conflict with each other, right? That this whole language of particular and general makes sense only in the context of part-whole structures, in which it's important for us to try to get the parts to coordinate in a kind of coherent whole. So applied to politics, this general will, particular will rubric is going to refer, as it does in Rousseau, of course, to the standing possibility that there will always be a potential conflict between the particular wills of individuals and the general will of the community as a whole to which they belong, right? So what Rousseau is concerned with in using this language of the general as opposed to the particular will is how to reconcile the particular wills of individuals, their particular desires and wishes, with a general idea of the will of the people as a whole. Keep in mind here what I was saying earlier, that for Rousseau the category of the will is tied crucially to this notion of freedom as self-determination. So a person or a society is free or at liberty, on Rousseau's account, to the extent that they are self-determining, to the extent that they act in accordance with their own wills. So in trying to get clear on the relationship between the general will of a society as a whole and the particular wills of its constituent individuals, Rousseau is assuming that we're concerned to reconcile the freedom of individuals with the freedom of their political community. The question is, how do you come up with a formula that brings those two things into alignment? And his basic objection to Hobbes, is just a different way of putting what I've already said, is that Hobbes fails to adequately reconcile general and particular. Why? Because for Hobbes, the will of the people, what Rousseau regards as the general will, can only be the will of another particular individual, the sovereign, and that sovereign then represents the will of the people by speaking on their behalf. But according to Rousseau anyway, this precludes any genuine community of purpose, any genuine integration of particular wills and the general will of the people as a whole. So rather than reconciling the general and the particular by harmonizing people's particular wills with an overarching general will, Hobbes winds up with a political theory that resolves the antagonism that exists between the opposing wills of particular individuals by simply asking citizens to unilaterally surrender all at once to one particular will, the will of a particular individual, whoever it is, or whichever body is named the sovereign, right? And Rousseau thinks, therefore, that Hobbes doesn't really have a fully adequate concept of what a general will is. He kind of grasps its form. He realizes that it's that will that can be identified as that of the whole community, right? But because he allows some one individual or group to use their own particular wills to represent the will of the whole, Hobbes hasn't really specified the content of the general will and hasn't really explained how the general will can allow a political community to be free in the sense of self-determining, in the sense of following its own collective wishes for itself. So to overcome this Hobbesian bind, Rousseau thinks you've got to create a political formula in which everyone understands that there's a clear contrast between the general will of the whole group and the particular wills of individuals and associations within a society. And it's got to be the case that citizens are disposed to give priority to the general will, but in a way that is in harmony with and not at odds with their particular wills. So what we're aiming for is a political formula in which everyone, consistent with their commitment to their own particular needs and wants, their own particular wills, consistent with that, everyone nonetheless is also able to identify with the general will as an aspect of themselves, a moi commun, as he puts it, a common me, right? That part of my will that I share with all of my fellow compatriots, right? So you've got to come up, Rousseau thinks, with a formula that enables that to be possible. And until you do that, we're going to be stuck in this Hobbesian bind in which a people basically gives itself, surrenders its freedom to a representative sovereign that is really just another particular person. And then, yes, it speaks on our behalf, but there's no real sense in which we are asserting our collective will to govern ourselves in our own way. We're simply surrendering that power to govern ourselves as we choose to this third-party representative. And that, for Rousseau, is the opposite of political freedom, not its realization. And Rousseau's social contract, or his social compact, as he prefers to call it, purports to meet those conditions, because he thinks it produces a fair and equitable association, not just a kind of aggregation of different separate individuals. Its ruling principle is a principle of reciprocity, because Rousseau thinks that in his social contract, each person agrees to be equally a subject to the sovereign and its general will, but obtains also an equal voice as a member of the sovereign. So there's a kind of reciprocity on both sides. We're equally subjects, but we're equally members of the sovereign, right? That's the sort of democratic element in all of this. When you follow that formula, a society, Rousseau maintains, can give laws to itself, and because it can do that, this allows the people who participate in general willing, by voting as members of the sovereign to impose rules to which they all agree they are equally subject, it allows a people to be genuinely free and self-determining, and only to follow their own wills. And Rousseau thinks that this formula institutes what we could call a weak procedural guarantee that the laws won't oppress individuals. And his thought here seems to be something like the following. Because the general will has to be formulated in terms of general laws that apply without exception to everyone who legislates them, it follows, Rousseau thinks, that each will tend to vote only for those expectations on others that they would be willing to impose on themselves. And Rousseau thinks that that builds into his formula for sovereignty an inherent protection. No one is going to vote for any general principle that might expose themselves to oppression at the hands of the majority. That's the general sort of reciprocal ideal that lies at the heart of Rousseau's story. Now, it's pretty clear, and it's pretty clear also that Rousseau implicitly acknowledges this, that Rousseau does not think that his formula gives an automatic guarantee against political oppression of the individual at the hands of the political community. And that he implicitly acknowledges this is shown by the fact that throughout the book he insists on various additional safeguards that he thinks have to be in place if the general will is to emerge as he thinks it should from the deliberations of the sovereign. And I'm going to discuss those in some detail in the next lecture. But the final point for today is that notice that in taking this general view, although Rousseau is plainly reacting against Hobbes, it's important to recognize that in substance, his view is far more Hobbesian than Lockean. And I just want to end by mentioning a couple of these key Hobbesian assumptions that are preserved in Rousseau's view. Notice, and I'll talk more about this in the next lecture too, Rousseau preserves Hobbes' strong distinction between sovereignty and government. If you look at the 8th letter from the mountain in the little extract, that's particularly clear. But it's also clear in the text of the social contract itself. And while Rousseau is a fan, well, not just a fan, he insists that sovereignty must be democratic. He doesn't think that it's a good idea to have democratic government, right, to organize the day-to-day running of public life in a democratic way. And I may get a chance to talk about that later on in the next lecture. Secondly, Rousseau accepts the Hobbesian idea that the sovereign is above the law, right? Because the sovereign is what gives the law. It can't bind itself, right? It can't pass a law that then prevents it from repealing that same law in 10 years' time. So in that sense, Rousseau's sovereign, democratic as it is, retains the feature that it is not legally limited in any way, because it is the source of all law, right? There is no source of law independent of and above Rousseau's sovereign, and that's very close to Hobbes's view. Like Hobbes's view, citizens surrender in Rousseau's social contract. They surrender themselves totally to the judgment of the sovereign. He talks of the total alienation of each, that should say, associate, not association. Each associate totally alienates themselves to the sovereign and its decisions. There is no right to resist a legitimate sovereign. Rousseau says that those who disobey must be forced to be free. They must be forced to go along with their agreement, their unanimous agreement to the original contract that established the sovereign. And again, that's very close to Hobbes. He explicitly, in Book 3, Chapter 16, he explicitly rejects any kind of double contract a la Locke, in which a people conditionally accepts governments on enumerated terms. So he shares the Hobbesian doubt that it makes sense to believe that you can have a people in advance of the establishment of a sovereign that then negotiates the terms on which sovereignty is exercised. He doesn't like that idea at all, and in that he's very, very close to Hobbes. And finally, despite some apparent sympathies with Locke's understanding of property, in general, and very clearly in the discourse on the origin of inequality, as you'll see later in the semester, Rousseau is quite suspicious of the institution of private property, sees it as a conventional thing rather than a natural right, subject to adjustment by the sovereign as it chooses, and as we'll also see in the next lecture, rejects sharp disparities and inequalities of wealth because he regards those as tending to corrupt the kind of democratic self-sovereignty that he's promoting in the text. But I'll say more about these features in the next lecture. Okay, thank you.